Get your mop and get out of my sight before I call security on a confused old man wandering these halls at midnight." The words hit the hallway of Hawthorne Ridge Senior Living like a slammed door, and every resident within earshot turned to look. Desmond Farrow stood there in his gray janitor's uniform, a ring of keys in one hand and a rolled length of yellowed paper tucked under his arm, and he did not flinch. He simply looked at Preston Vale, the new regional administrator, the way a man looks at a crack in a wall he already knows is going to bring the ceiling down. "Mr. Vale," Desmond said quietly, "you need to evacuate the east mezzanine. Tonight. Not tomorrow." "What I need," Preston said, loud enough for the dining room to hear, "is for the maintenance staff to stop pretending they run this building. Go home, Desmond. Or wherever it is you go at 2 in the morning." Behind him, propped against the wall where he'd left it minutes earlier, was a steel support jack, the kind you'd use to shore up a floor that was failing. Nobody in that hallway understood yet why a 74-year-old man with a mop bucket had one. In about 11 minutes, they would. But to understand how a janitor ended up holding a steel jack in the middle of the night, staring down the man who could fire him with a signature, you have to go back. 60 hours back, to be exact, to the Tuesday morning Preston Vale first walked through the doors of Hawthorne Ridge with a clipboard, a consulting firm's badge, and absolutely no idea whose building he was standing in. And hey, before we get into it, drop in the comments what country you're watching from tonight. I love seeing how far these stories travel, and this one's about to go somewhere I don't think you're expecting. 60 hours earlier. Hawthorne Ridge sat on a quiet rise outside a mid-sized town in Ohio, a long, low, brick and glass building that had been a fixture in the community for 41 years. It didn't look like a place with secrets. It looked like what it was, a well-worn retirement home with wide hallways, a sunroom full of ferns, and a dining hall that smelled perpetually of coffee and lemon polish. Desmond Farrow had worked there for 6 years as the maintenance man. He mopped floors, fixed leaking faucets, changed light fixtures, and was, by every resident's account, the quietest and most reliable person on staff. He wore his gray uniform every day without complaint, kept his white hair cropped close, and moved through the building with a kind of unhurried precision that some of the younger aides found almost strange, like he wasn't just walking the halls, he was reading them. Nobody at Hawthorne Ridge knew that Desmond Farrow had a stamped architectural license that had never lapsed. Nobody knew that 41 years ago, a much younger Desmond had stood on this exact plot of land, in a hard hat, holding a set of blueprints with his own name printed in the corner, Farrow and Associates, Structural Design. He had designed Hawthorne Ridge from the ground up, every load path, every beam, every inch of wiring conduit run through walls that residents now hung family photos on. And nobody knew about Miriam. Miriam Farrow had been his wife for 46 years, and for the last 4 of them, as her memory slipped away by inches, she had lived in the East Wing Memory Care Unit of the very building her husband had designed. Desmond had taken the janitor job not because he needed the money, his pension from decades of consulting work was more than enough, but because it was the only way the administration at the time would let him be present in the building every single day, all day, without raising questions. He mopped her hallway. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her door himself, twice, because he liked the excuse to check on her. He sat with her in the evenings after his shift ended, in a chair he'd built with his own hands out of walnut, a small wooden bird carved into the armrest, a wren, her favorite, because 40 years earlier, on the day he'd proposed to her at a park bench, a wren had landed 3 feet away and Miriam had laughed so hard she'd cried, and said that was a sign, and he'd never forgotten it. Miriam died 3 years ago, in that room, in that wing. And Desmond Farrow never left. He told the staff he stayed on because he liked the routine. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that leaving Hawthorne Ridge felt like leaving her a second time, and he wasn't willing to do that. So he kept mopping. He kept a small toolbox in a locked utility closet that held things no other janitor would carry, a laser level, a moisture meter, a folded set of the building's original structural drawings, and a spiral notebook where, for the last 18 months, he had been quietly logging something that worried him more than he let on. Because 6 years into working there, Desmond had noticed something in the east wing. A hairline crack in the drywall above the corridor outside room 114, Miriam's old room, now occupied by a resident named Harriet Voss. At first he'd assumed it was cosmetic settling, the kind every building develops. But he'd measured it. Then measured it again 8 months later. It had grown. Not by much. Just over 3 millimeters. But 3 millimeters in a structural connection was not nothing. It was a warning. He knew exactly what was above that crack, because he had drawn it himself in 1985, a steel connection joint at column line B7, where a laminated support beam carried the load of the entire second-floor mezzanine lounge down into the ground floor corridor. It was a critical connection. And 2 years ago, under a previous administration eager to modernize, a contractor hired to redo the mezzanine flooring had removed a section of what they believed was a non-load-bearing partition wall to open up sightlines for a new sitting area. Desmond had tried to explain, gently, respectfully, that the wall in question actually helped distribute lateral load away from that connection. He'd been told, politely, that the renovation had already been approved and paid for, and that a janitor's opinion, however well-intentioned, wasn't really his to give. So Desmond had done the only thing he could. He watched. He measured. He documented everything in that spiral notebook, dates, crack widths, moisture readings, temperature logs, because steel connections behave differently under thermal expansion, and Ohio winters into summers put real stress on old joints. He photographed the crack every few weeks with a small ruler beside it for scale. And he waited for someone in administration who would actually listen. Preston Vale was not that person. Preston arrived that Tuesday morning as part of a corporate takeover. Hawthorne Ridge had been acquired 8 months earlier by a regional healthcare group called Larkspur Senior Communities, and Preston had been sent in as the new site administrator with a single mandate from corporate: cut operating costs by 22% within the fiscal year, no exceptions. He was 38 years old, wore suits that were slightly too sharp for a building full of grandparents, and had made his name at 2 previous facilities by slashing maintenance budgets and staffing hours. He walked the halls that first day with a tablet, tapping notes, and one of the first line items he circled in red was, maintenance, 1 full-time position, recommend reduce to part-time or contract as needed. He met Desmond on day 1, in passing, in the supply closet, and didn't bother learning his name. By day 2, he'd learned it, but not out of respect. "You're Faro," Preston said, catching him in the East Wing corridor outside room 114, where Desmond was on his knees with a small flashlight, examining the base of the wall. "The one who filed 40 internal maintenance requests about a crack in the drywall." 18 months of logged readings, Desmond corrected. "Not a filing complaint. A structural concern." Preston crouched slightly, glanced at the hairline crack, and straightened up with the expression of a man who just wasted 4 seconds of his life. "That's cosmetic settling. Every old building has it. I'm not authorizing an engineering firm to come out here and charge us $8,000 to tell me what a fresh coat of spackle can fix for $40. I'd like to request the connection be inspected before the wiring project moves forward," Desmond said. "Not spackled over." Because that was the second half of the problem, the part that made Desmond's stomach tighten every time he walked past the electrical panel in the East Wing basement. Larkspur's cost-cutting renovation plan, the one Preston had been sent to execute, included rerouting fire alarm and sprinkler control wiring through the same wall cavity at column B7, cheaper than running new conduit around it, and abandoning the older, redundant fire suppression sensor loop that Desmond himself had specified back in the original 1985 design specifically because that corridor served the memory care unit, where evacuation took longer and margins for error needed to be wider. Removing the redundant loop to save conduit costs would leave a single point of failure exactly where the structural connection was already showing signs of stress. 2 problems, 1 location, 1 deadline, and 1 administrator who saw all of it as line items instead of walls that people's mothers and fathers lived behind. "Mr. Faro," Preston said, in the tone of a man delivering news he considered generous, "I appreciate initiative. I do. But you clean floors. You don't approve capital projects, and you definitely don't tell an engineering team how to run conduit. If it makes you feel better, I'll have someone spackle that crack this week." Desmond looked at him for a long moment. He'd spent 40 years of his career being listened to in rooms full of engineers, contractors, and city inspectors. He'd designed hospital wings and school gymnasiums and, once, a courthouse annex that still stood without a single structural complaint after 36 years. He was not used to being waved off like a man who didn't understand what he was looking at. But he also understood something Preston didn't, that dignity wasn't worth losing his position over, not when losing that position meant losing his ability to watch this building, to be near the room where Miriam had spent her last 4 years, to keep the wren carved into that walnut chair dusted and untouched exactly where she'd left it. So he said nothing more that day. He went back to his utility closet, opened the spiral notebook, and wrote down the date, and beneath it, requested inspection. Denied. Wiring project proceeding as scheduled. Monitoring continues. That was the pattern for the next several weeks. Desmond raised the issue 3 more times through official channels, a written maintenance request, a conversation with the facilities coordinator, and finally a formal memo he left on Preston's desk with photographs of the crack progression clipped to it. Each time, the response came back the same: the budget was approved, the renovation was on schedule, and the crack was cosmetic. Preston, for his part, grew visibly irritated at what he'd started calling, in front of other staff, Faro's little hobby. He began making comments. Small ones at first: "There goes our resident structural engineer," muttered to a nurse within earshot, followed by a smirk. Then bigger ones, delivered with an audience. The renovation crew finished the mezzanine wall removal on a Thursday. By that Friday, the wiring subcontractor had begun pulling the old redundant sensor loop out of the wall cavity at column B7, exactly as Preston had authorized, to save an estimated $11,000 in conduit routing. Desmond watched them do it from the hallway, said nothing to the crew, they were just following a signed work order, and went home that night and didn't sleep. Saturday, he came in on his day off, badge still active, and took his own readings. The crack had grown again. 4 millimeters now, in 9 days, faster than it had moved in the previous 18 months combined, and he understood immediately why. The load path that wall had been distributing was now funneling entirely through the compromised connection at B7, and removing the old sensor loop meant that if that connection failed suddenly rather than gradually, there would be no early warning system left in that specific stretch of wall to catch smoke or heat before it spread. He measured it 3 times to be sure, photographed it with the ruler, logged it, and then sat in the hallway on an overturned bucket with his notebook in his lap for a long time, thinking about the 62 residents currently sleeping in the East Wing, 14 of them in memory care, all of them slower to move than they used to be, all of them trusting a building that a man in a sharp suit had decided was just a line item. Monday morning, he went to Preston's office one more time, not with a memo this time, but with the original 1985 structural drawings rolled under his arm, and asked, as calmly as he had ever asked anything in his life, for an independent structural engineer to inspect column B7 before the wiring project was signed off as complete. Preston didn't even look up from his monitor. "Desmond. I've told you 3 times. If you bring this up a 4th time, I'm going to have a conversation with HR about whether this job is still the right fit for you. I don't say that to be cruel. I say it because I need staff who trust the process, not staff who think 40 years of pushing a mop makes them an engineer. I'm not pushing a mop because I don't understand buildings, Mr. Vale," Desmond said. I'm pushing a mop because it lets me stay close to one. Preston finally looked up, unimpressed. Sure. Whatever gets you through the day. Desmond left the office and did not come back to argue again. He had said his piece through every proper channel available to him, 4 separate times, and been dismissed 4 separate times by a man who had been in the building less than 3 weeks. So he did something else instead. He went to his utility closet, unlocked the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet that had come with him from his consulting days, and pulled out a business card he hadn't needed to use in over a decade, a structural engineer named Priya Nandakumar, who had trained under him 30 years ago and now ran her own firm 2 counties over. He called her that afternoon, off the record, as a friend, and asked her a favor. He described the connection, the crack progression, the removed wall, the abandoned sensor loop. She listened without interrupting and then said the words that confirmed everything he already feared. Desmond, that's not settling. That's a progressive shear failure risk, and if that loop's really gone, you've got 0 redundancy left in that corridor. You need to get people out of there or get it shored immediately. That was Monday evening. Desmond spent that night in his garage, the one place in his small house that still smelled faintly like his old drafting studio, assembling a portable steel support jack from equipment he'd kept for exactly this kind of situation, because a man who spends 40 years designing buildings doesn't stop thinking about how to save one, even after he's retired the title. He loaded it into his truck along with a headlamp, his notebook, the original blueprints, and every photograph he'd taken over 18 months, printed and dated and organized in a plain manila folder. Tuesday, he tried Preston one final time, first thing in the morning, calmly laying the folder on his desk. Preston didn't open it. I'm not doing this again, Desmond. This is your last warning. So Desmond waited. He worked his shift like nothing was wrong, mopped the sunroom, fixed a dripping faucet in room 108, ate his dinner alone in the break room like always. And then, near midnight, when the halls were quiet and most of the residents were asleep, he took his flashlight and his jack and went to check the crack one final time before he went home. It had grown again. Visibly this time. A hairline had become a gap you could slide a fingernail into, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible sag in the ceiling tile track above it that hadn't been there 12 hours earlier. Desmond didn't hesitate. He called the night charge nurse, told her to begin quietly moving residents out of the 4 rooms closest to column B7 as a precaution, and began setting up the steel jack himself to relieve pressure on the connection while they waited for the fire department's structural response team, whom he'd also called, giving them his old credential number from memory, a number that, it turned out, was still on file with the county as a licensed structural engineer of record. That was when Preston Vale, alerted by a panicked front desk call about the janitor moving residents in the middle of the night, came storming down the east wing corridor in his pajama pants and an untucked polo, furious, certain this was some kind of unauthorized stunt. Which brings us back to where we started. Get your mop and get out of my sight before I call security on a confused old man wandering these halls at midnight, Preston said, loud enough that Harriet Voss, standing in her doorway in a robe, gasped audibly, and 2 aides froze in the hallway behind him. Desmond didn't raise his voice. Mr. Vale, you need to evacuate the east mezzanine. Tonight. Not tomorrow. What I need is for the maintenance staff to stop pretending they run this building, Preston snapped. Go home, Desmond. Or wherever it is you go at 2 in the morning. That was when the low groan came from somewhere above them, not loud, but unmistakable, the sound of old steel shifting under a load it could no longer distribute evenly, and a fine dusting of drywall powder sifted down from the ceiling seam directly above column B7 like the first flakes of snow before a storm. Every person in that hallway went silent. Preston looked up. For the first time since he'd walked through the doors of Hawthorne Ridge, his composure cracked. That's the mezzanine floor above us starting to redistribute load through a connection that's already lost 30% of its original capacity, Desmond said, calm and clear, the voice of a man who had spent his whole life explaining exactly this kind of thing to rooms full of people who needed to move quickly and not panic. Your renovation crew removed a shear wall 2 weeks ago that this connection depended on. Your electrical contractor pulled the redundant fire sensor loop out of that same cavity 4 days ago to save $11,000. I told you both of those things would compound. I told you 4 times. Who? Preston's voice actually shook. Who told you any of that? What are you even talking about? Desmond set down the jack, reached into the folder he'd carried under his arm all night, and pulled out a rolled sheet of original blueprint paper, yellowed with 4 decades of age, and unrolled it against the wall under the corridor light. In the bottom corner, in ink that had faded to sepia but was still perfectly legible, was a stamp, Desmond A. Faro, licensed structural engineer, Faro and Associates, 1985. Because I designed this building, Desmond said. Every beam, every column, every wire run through every wall you've spent the last 3 weeks treating like a spreadsheet. This connection right here, he tapped the drawing, column line B7, is why I've spent 18 months measuring a crack you called cosmetic. This is the sensor loop I specified for exactly this corridor because it serves memory care, where people can't move fast, and your team ripped it out to save money 4 days ago. Silence. Somewhere down the hall, another resident had come to their door. Harriet Voss stood with a hand over her mouth. One of the aides had her phone out, recording without thinking, the instinct of a generation that documents everything. That can't be right, Preston said, but his voice had lost all its earlier certainty. You're a janitor. I've been a janitor here for 6 years, Desmond said. For 4 of those years, my wife Miriam lived in room 114, right there, at the end of this hallway, in memory care, until she passed. I took this job to be near her every single day, because after 46 years of marriage, I wasn't going to let a job title decide how close I got to sit with her. I stayed after she died because leaving felt like losing her twice. I kept this building's structural notes going the whole time because it was mine before it was Larkspur's, and mine before it was yours, Mr. Vale, and I was not about to let it fail the next Miriam sleeping in that wing because somebody in a suit thought a crack in a wall was cheaper to ignore than fix. Preston stood frozen, staring at the stamped blueprint, then at the dust still faintly sifting from the ceiling seam above them, then at the phone recording him from 6 feet away. You said I was a confused old man wandering the halls, Desmond said, not with anger, just with the flat clarity of a man laying the final piece of evidence on the table. Mr. Vale, I've walked these halls at odd hours for 18 months because I was the only person in this building who understood what that crack meant and was willing to keep watching it after you told me 4 times to stop. If anyone's confused about what's actually holding this building up, I don't think it's me. The fire department's structural response team arrived 9 minutes later, confirmed everything Desmond had documented within the hour, evacuated the 4 closest rooms as a precaution, installed emergency shoring at column B7 before dawn, and by the following afternoon, an independent engineering firm, the one Preston had refused to authorize 4 separate times, arrived to confirm what Priya Nanda Kumar and Desmond already knew: the connection had lost roughly 1/3 of its rated capacity. The removed wall and the abandoned sensor loop had compounded the risk exactly as Desmond predicted, and had it failed suddenly rather than gradually, the section of ceiling above the memory care corridor could have come down with residents inside it, with no early fire sensor redundancy left to buy them the extra minutes they would have needed to get out safely. Larkspur Senior Communities opened a formal investigation within 48 hours. Desmond's 18 months of dated, measured, photographed logs, the ones Preston had dismissed as a hobby, became the central piece of evidence. The video one of the aides had recorded in the hallway, showing Preston's public dismissal followed immediately by his own contractor's negligence being laid bare in front of residents, made its way, inevitably, onto the internet, and within a week had been viewed by more people than had ever set foot inside Hawthorne Ridge. Preston Vale was placed on administrative leave the same week and terminated the following month, the investigation citing disregard for documented safety concerns and failure to authorize independent structural review despite repeated, credentialed staff warnings. He did not appeal. Hawthorne Ridge's ownership, facing the kind of public attention no cost-cutting memo could survive, did two things almost immediately. First, they fully funded the structural remediation at column B7, new steel connection plates, a rebuilt shear wall, and a modernized version of the redundant fire sensor loop Desmond had specified 41 years earlier, now updated with current technology but built on the same principle he'd insisted on from the very beginning: no single point of failure in a hallway where people can't move fast. Second, they offered Desmond Farrow a position as the facility's official consulting structural advisor, a paid role that would let him keep an office in the building, keep his hands on every future renovation decision, and formally recognize the 41 years of history he'd quietly been guarding without ever once mentioning it to a soul. He accepted, on one condition. He asked that the small sitting nook outside room 114, the one that had once held the wall Preston's renovation had removed, be rebuilt not as an open sightline feature, but as a modest reading alcove, with a single chair in it. He built the chair himself, in his garage, out of walnut, the same wood as the one still sitting in what had once been Miriam's room. And into the armrest, with the same set of chisels he'd used 40 years earlier, he carved a small wren. At the small ceremony Hawthorne Ridge held a few weeks later, nothing grand, just residents, staff, a few former colleagues of Desmond's who'd read about the story online and driven in from 3 states away, the facility's new administrator, a woman named Colette Abra brought in to replace Preston, unveiled a small brass plaque outside the alcove. It read simply, "This corner was built to last, by a man who never stopped watching over it. In memory of Miriam Farrow, and in honor of the architect who never really left." Desmond stood in front of it for a long moment, then sat down in the walnut chair, in the exact spot where he used to sit beside his wife every evening after his shift ended, and ran his thumb over the carved wren the way he had 1,000 times before. Harriet Voss, who'd stood in her doorway that terrible night in her robe, found him there afterward and asked him something a lot of people in that building had been wondering since the story broke. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone who you really were? All those years?" Desmond thought about it for a moment. "Because the moment people know you designed a building," he said, "they stop asking if you're allowed to care about it. I didn't want permission to care about this place. I just wanted to be here. There's something worth sitting with in that. We live in a world that's very good at deciding, at a glance, who has the right to speak up in a room, who counts as an expert, who's just staff, who's just old, who's just a janitor with a mop." Desmond Farrow spent 40 years earning the right to design buildings that would outlast him, and then spent the last 6 quietly earning something harder, the discipline to let himself be underestimated, over and over, because the thing he was protecting mattered more than the credit for protecting it. Preston Vale looked at a 74-year-old man wandering the halls at midnight and saw confusion. What was actually standing in front of him was the only person in that entire building who had never once stopped paying attention. So here's the question I'll leave you with tonight. If the quietest person in the room, the one everybody's stopped really looking at, tried to warn you about something important, would you actually listen? Or would you need to see the ceiling crack first? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and what you'd have done in Preston's shoes at that office desk, the first time Desmond walked in with those blueprints. If this story got you in the chest a little, hit subscribe, because Strength Stories has a lot more people like Desmond Farrow waiting to be told, the ones who never needed the title to do the job right, and never needed applause to keep showing up. We'll see you in the next one.